All right, welcome back to the program. You're watching AM Live as we take a look at what's been making headlines this morning. And today in the afternoon, we'll be expecting the Finance Bill 2023 to be tabled in Parliament once again for a third reading. There are still a number of contentious clauses that has caused quite a division in the country, and especially being fronted by the opposition legislators in Parliament. There has been a lot that has happened since last week on Wednesday until up until the budget was read on Thursday by the Treasury and Planning Cabinet Secretary. But today, as that happens, what we expect to see is the members of Parliament will be voting clause by clause on a number of issues within that finance bill. And just this morning, I'm being joined by Faith Ann Kenyanju, who is a public finance practitioner from the International Budget Partnerships Kenya. And we'll also be joined a little bit in just a moment by Wanjiku Kimani, who is the executive committee member from the Kenya Gender Budget Network. Unfortunately, we were going to be joined by Member of Parliament Marianne Ketani from that is a member of Parliament, but she has apologized. She will not be joining us today morning, so we'll just continue with that conversation. But as we have this discussion, Faith Ann, let me get your view, first of all, on what you think some of the key areas of concern for you when you take a look at that bill as it is right now. It has already sailed through the second reading. Today is going to be quite crucial. But really, what are some of the key concerns for you when you look at that bill? There are a number of things that, have been fronted by the opposition and has been a center of debate across the country, especially on the issue of the housing levy, which is now a tax at 1.5%, but a number of other things. Just from your perspective, give us an idea.
Okay. I think first, we have to look at the context that surrounds the finance bill, because I believe the context is what is playing a major role even in the discussions that we're having currently, what proposals are being made, what amendments need to be made, and so on. Because when you look at the context within which this finance bill is coming, first of all, we were coming into a new government, so that was one. So the government has priorities, they had commitments that they had made, and so right now this is what we are seeing, the bottom-up economic transformational agenda. So the new government comes in and it has its priorities that have to be financed. So in one way or the other, then resources have to be appropriated through the budget. Finance bill raises that revenue. Number two, we have the public debt situation. So when you look at our figures and debt repayment, in addition to the debt obligations that are falling due, we still are always servicing debt, paying interest every year as we go on. So our debt repayment and when you look at our debt servicing compared to the revenue that we are collecting, there has been a little bit... it's
a mismatch there.
Yes, there is a mismatch there in terms of, especially when you look at the ratio of debt service to ordinary revenue ratio. And we have really breached the sustainability level. So 30% is where I would say we are sustainable in terms of our public debt. But currently, we are looking to go over 50%, 63% if the current proposals go as they are. And the 63% is based on ordinary revenue that we expect to collect. So the 2.57 trillion, and we are pegging that on if we collect the 2.57 trillion, then 63% of that goes towards servicing debt. So then what we will be left with, if we consider the proposals that have been made already in terms of expenditure estimates, but also the allocations that goes to counties, then we are left with 37% to do everything else. So that is number two. Number three is also the high cost of living. So that's why you'll see a lot of people, there was a lot of public uproar when it comes to the proposals that were made with regard to the finance bill, because essentially what they were doing is they're taking more from the pocket of Kenyans. So then you're already taking more from the pocket of Kenyans. We are having challenges with high cost of living. The cost of goods is going up. The cost of doing business is going up. It's already expensive. So I believe those three things surrounding the finance bill is why we are seeing the kind of debate, the conversations that we are having today. Yeah. All right.
So then, but when you sit and look at the finance bill really in its totality, what are some of the key issues of concern for you? And would say perhaps, perhaps there's a number of those clauses that really, do they work for the common mwananchi really?
There are several, I'd say, quote unquote, problematic clauses that
Right.
have been put out there in terms of how they affect different groups of people. First of all, we can talk of course, the housing levy and how that, first of all, there was lack of clarity around that initially. Was it a contribution? Was it a levy? Was it a tax? And all that. But what the housing levy does, especially for those who are salaried. So if you have a pay slip, then initially we had the proposal of 3%, which your employer was supposed to match, but now we're having the 1.5%, but now it has no cap. So there is...
Which now we know is actually now not even going to a fund, which
Right.
is now going to be a tax.
It is a tax.
And then you have salaried workers who don't have an increase in their income.
Right.
The disposable income perhaps will go down. So then what does that mean for, you know, the individual, you know, persons, what do you call it, like their own little economy,
Right.
ecosystem for themselves and their families? What does that mean for them?
It just means that you now have less.
Right.
You will have less to spend on everything else that you
Will
get
that have
as
a
an
larger
individual.
impact on the economy?
It will have a larger impact, one, on the individuals, but also subsequently on the economy. And I think just to refer to one of the statistics by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics on poverty. So recently a report was put out there on poverty rates. And when you look at the numbers in 2015-16, when you had the last report and the current report, previously in 2015-16, poverty rates were at 36.1%. So 36.1% of Kenyans are poor. But currently, as of 2021, it is at 38%. It's very unlikely for poverty rate to increase, because then you expect, if things are happening as they should be in the economy, then you expect the poverty rate should be going down. So when you look at that context around poverty rates, just as a statistic to assess cost of living and how people are faring on, then more and more deductions like housing levy, you have now increased rates, proposed increased rates on NHIF, NSSF. So you as a salaried worker, then that affects you. But you also have these other taxation proposals that affect everyone in general, VAT, so the VAT on fuel, for instance, which the committee has said it will be retained at the proposed 16%, so that is not really going down. You have other proposals that are affecting the digital content creators, so the withholding tax. What does that mean for an emerging economy? You have other proposals around excise duty that will affect, for instance, the one on importation of sugar. In as much as that is supposed to spur local production and manufacturing of sugar, then in the meantime, even as the local industry struggles, then what does that mean for cost of sugar in the long run? Yeah.
So that's quite something. All right, but then when you look at the bill, which seeks to raise what, 289 billion tax revenue, this is between now and 2024. That's quite a staggering number, don't you agree? Is it viable that we can manage that?
So the Finance and Planning Committee actually revised the number downwards to 211 billion in their report. And the reason for this reduction is because of the amendments that they introduced compared to the initial finance bill, which they also note that the proposals, especially the tax revenue proposals, they're significantly higher than usual. Parliament, the Budget and Appropriations Committee also notes the same in terms of the revenue projections. So I think almost everyone seems to agree that the tax proposals and everything we are proposing around expenditure and revenue, it's a little bit ambitious. Just some numbers to it. When you look at our tax revenue collection for the current year that is ending 30th June, we, as of 31st March, we had only collected 66.1% of the total tax revenue that we expect to collect.
By 30th of March, which is less than 2 months to the end of the financial year.
Less than 2 months to the end of the financial year. So then, in those 2 months, government should have collected the remaining 33.9%. So you see, there are chances or possibility that we will not hit those revenue collection targets. So then on what basis are we saying that we are going to collect significantly more, 17% if we compare it to expected revenue collection? So what is expected to have been collected by the end of this year and what is proposed for 2023-24, that will be around a 17% increase, which is significantly higher compared to previous increase, which averages around 10%. So around 10%, that is when revenue would increase from year on. But for this particular, it's way up at around 17%. So that's significantly high. It is ambitious. As to whether the collection, we are able to collect such amount of revenue remains to be seen. But when you look at historical data, then there are possibilities that we might not meet that target. And then what does that mean for us? Do we then come back and say, let us revise expenditure downward because we are unable to meet targets? So that has not often been the case. That's not how it has happened. Because now if government doesn't meet expenditure estimates, and oftentimes when you see a supplementary budget introduced, it is not necessarily to reduce expenditure. It is often, if additional items are not coming in, you will see our deficit going up within year, because then we are projecting certain shortfalls on revenue, then we expect to borrow more. Right.
So well, let me ask you, because this is a question that continues to really be asked a lot of times, which is the issue of, then is it an issue of taxes or is it an issue of expenditure? Do we need to increase the taxes, to raise more revenue, ordinary revenue, or then we need to cap our expenditure? And, the government needs to just really backtrack on the issue of expenditure and say, look, we can't manage this. We have to reduce what we are spending on, and perhaps decrease the weight of what is going to hit the common man in terms of taxes.
Right. So yes, we neither have a debt problem or a revenue problem. So I think one of the main problems, or the root of all our problems, comes from expenditure, as you rightly put it. So we have an expenditure problem. And if we do not tame our expenditures, if we are not trying to spend right, however that looks like, then that's why we are always aiming, let's collect more. If we cannot meet our revenue collection targets, then we have to borrow more. Borrowing more has future implications on our debt servicing in future. So then we have to service that debt going forward, and we are constantly accumulating our debt stock. So that's not a good sign. In terms of what government can do, even to just rationalize the expenditure and just spend better. So they talk about cutting non-priority expenditure and all that, and spending that is in line with certain priorities. So for instance, the bottom-up economic transformational agenda, we are trying to spur the economy. We are trying to do a bit more in terms of development and all that. But there are still areas that government could prioritize, because then at the end of the day, when you look at budgets, revenue, expenditure, it is about prioritization. When you budget even for yourself as an individual, you sit down and you decide, okay, I can do this, I can manage this, this I can do later on, this I don't necessarily have to do. So it is also about prioritization. So government has to, first of all, tame expenditure. So then we are talking about, we have tamed our expenditure. So then how do we go about revenue collection and managing our debt?
Okay. Well, but some would argue that perhaps the bigger issue, right, is, yes, caused by the issue of expenditure. Right. But the government must have money to spend on issues of, we have recurrent bills, we have development. Like, for example, when you have the Kenya Kwanza government, which has its bottom-up economic development agenda, they have already promised Kenyans that they were going to do this. So what does that mean for a government which intends to, to implement its policies? There is no money, but they must get some money somewhere, which goes on to borrowing and increasing our debt, right? Yeah. Where else would they get the money? Is it increasing the revenue? I mean, taxes, is that going to be helpful?
So from the last statement, the last question, whether it's increasing taxes, either widening the tax base or increasing tax rates does not necessarily equate to, does not mean you'll automatically collect higher revenues. So in as much as that is one of the measures, it cannot be the only one. And yes, government has to provide services. We need healthcare, we need education and all that. All these things have to be provided. Some of these things are basic requirements for an ordinary citizen. But there are other expenditure areas. And for instance, when I was talking about taming expenditures, we have state-owned enterprises or state corporations. Government government revenue goes to state-owned enterprises. Some of them do not have the reputation of doing really well in terms of profit making, and some of them, they're just making loss. That is a cost on government, and it's probably not a cost that government necessarily has to bear. So in one of the reports by the Parliamentary Budget Office, they put this as one of the proposals the government could undertake to not only tame expenditure, but also in line with their fiscal consolidation policy. And the potential that privatizing state-owned corporation has, according to the estimates done by the Parliamentary Budget Offices, is government could get around 30 billion annually from the privatization of state corporations. So one, they are saving money in that they no longer have to fund state corporations, but they're also getting money for them to be able, from the sale of the actual state corporations. And one of the places where these funds could be directed is not necessarily to expenditures. So that is why there is potential in this, because then when you get the revenue, the money from the sale or privatization of state-owned enterprises, recommendations are maybe do not spend that money in recurrent expenditure. Like, for instance, you could get, even individually, when you get a large sum of money, the advice is maybe spend it on something that you will help you later on down the line. So for government, this might look like spending on development expenditure, and maybe by so doing, because most of our development expenditure is funded by donor funded, it's from loans and grants, then you're able to cut a bit back on the more expensive loan. But also for these development projects, because then they're considered long-term, then down the line you're probably able to get some revenue from it, or the impact or the service that is provided is one that is sustainable in the long run.
Right. Yeah. All right, and also joining us as a panelist this morning as well is Wanjiku Kimani, who's Executive Committee member from the Kenya Gender Budget Network. A very good morning. Welcome to our studios. I hope you've had a good morning.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
I know it's quite chilly outside there, but at least here it's a bit warmer. Yeah. But anyway, welcome to the conversation as we're taking a look at the issue of the finance bill and really just the economy in general. Maybe my first question is, as you interact with the Finance Bill 2023, the report is adopted last week in Parliament. Today it goes for a third reading. I just want to understand from a gender perspective, do you think we have a gender-targeted expenditure as a country when we're looking at how we're spending our money?
Thank you, Zainab, and good morning, Kenya. Let me start by saying that we've been having a gender conversation for a very long time. And we've been talking about equality and equity in Parliament. And this finance bill is the first example of what happens when women are missing on that table. It is a painful example because when you look at Treasury, for example, it's all men. When you look at the committee, it's 15 men. When you look at the technical support, there are only 5 women out of 19. So women are not on that table. And what we are seeing is actually the effects of women not being on the table. Further, we all know that in our homes, when Mzee comes home and he has no money, he will throw a flimsy 200 and expect a fully cooked meal. I wish our president would actually incorporate women because we are very good at sharing resources when they are very thin. That being said, there are a lot of things that are gender inconsistent. For example, if you look at what has been handed to groups of people who are marginalized, the orphans, the vulnerable in the communities. So
now we're looking at least now at the allocations that were within the budget,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
It is unfortunate that that has come down. Yet we know that the effects of COVID have actually made a lot of people more vulnerable to fit into those brackets even higher. Yeah, and it then begs the question, because when Faith Ann and I are employed, we probably support a lot more other people than just our nuclear families, yeah? But because our incomes are getting smaller, then that support that trickles down to the families and to the other people maybe at home becomes less. And yet, the government has no intention of catering for those people. If you look at the allocations for things that have been questioned a lot, like things like integrity, allocations to institutions like the Auditor General's Office, allocations to institutions like the health docket, and allocations to institutions in agriculture, where we have protocols that actually call for us to put 10% for health and 15% for agriculture, where there would also be a lot of employment for Kenyans. We do not have sufficient, we do not meet the international instruments that we have signed up to. And so we are failing on that part. So from a gender perspective, it's a no.
I mean, when I look at the allocations of the budget, there was 182 million allocated to the Women Enterprise Fund. You have 192 million for the Uwezo Fund, and an additional 10 billion to the Hustlers Fund, which is aimed at increasing access to affordable credit to women. Isn't this something?
It's a trickle, because the cost of doing business is so much. And when you actually now come to the borrowing principle, to the borrowing regulations, then you find that even as you go as a group of 10 women, for instance, to borrow from the Women Fund, you're getting a maximum of 100,000. If you are actually to split that money individually and hold each other to account towards paying it back, it's 10,000 shillings, Zainab. 10,000 shillings to actually improve your business, which is being overtaxed. Is that really going forward, or is it looks good on paper, but practically it's not good. It's not realistic. Yeah.
All right. And Faithan, now when you look at that budget as well, let's go back to the issue of the budget that was presented by the Cabinet Secretary. It comes under very strict economic conditions in the country. Do you think it resonates to the tone of the struggling wananchi on the ground right now, who keeps complaining of the fact that we can't even afford a 2 kg packet of sugar or a 1 kg packet of unga at this point? Like, we have to reduce how we're spending at our homes at individual levels, that we have to reduce how much we eat in our own homes. Do you think it reads to that?
First of all, I think what we have here, what you're seeing, is a very expansionary budget. I mean, when you're looking at our fiscal space, we're seeing that it is contracting, because we are repaying more than we are left with. And yet we have this very huge budget that has to be funded, of course, which will mostly be funded through debt. But then when you look at closely at the proposals that are being made, and one of the things that is immediately clear is there's this focus on social sectors, social programs, and all that. So for instance, you talk about the fund, the Women Fund, there's a Youth Fund, there's the former Uwezo Fund, there's a Hustler Fund. There are very many funds here and there that, according to the language in the budget, are meant to go towards supporting the common wananchi, right? They're supposed to mean something to that individual.
That's why they call it what, the Hustler's budget, Wanjiku's budget. But really, does it resonate with Wanjiku?
So that's the question. That's the question. And I think one of the issues that we see in the budget, yes, there are programs here and there. Now, when you read, there are programs that are meant to help the common wananchi on paper. But then when you interrogate a little bit further in terms of the numbers and breaking it down, so what does this mean? So for instance, you have this 10 billion for the Hustlers Fund. What exactly does that mean? Another example we saw was for instance, there's a school feeding program that government runs, and it has been allocated around 4.8 billion to targeting 2.5 million school-going children. So when you look at that, you see that it almost responds
It looks very good on paper.
Yes, it almost responds to the need. But when you do the math, break that 4.8 million down in terms of the actual resource required to feed a child and for how long. It was coming to around 59 days. That for the amount that has been allocated for school feeding for the entire year can only cover 59 days. That is less than 2 months.
Right.
So what does that mean for the remaining days of the school year? What does that mean for the, it's not just 2.5 million kids who are in school, it's around 17 million in pre-primary, primary and secondary. So what does that really address the need that's there? And then, so then the question of who is being targeted, what proportion of Kenyans are actually being targeted? Is it targeting everyone? And that's why now it becomes important to look beyond the line, beyond the budget line, because then when you look beyond the budget line, then break it down further, it comes across as, okay, maybe we are not really targeting everyone. But even if we see we are not targeting everyone, who are we targeting? Is there accurate or adequate information for us to say these 2.5 million, say, school kids are in this counties, are in these areas, and they will be helped or assisted this way. So then we realize that there are certain gaps in as much as there are programs that in essence speak to the needs of the people and service delivery, then they do not really they do not cover the entire the gap that
do you think the gap is due to lack of perhaps enough research by the government in trying to understand the numbers that are there and the needs that are there on the ground? What could be leading to this gap?
First of all, I don't think it's a question of the government doesn't have the data, because the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics
clearly has all the numbers.
Has the data. The 17 million I'm quoting is from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, compared to the 2.5 million that are being targeting. So it's not necessarily that we have a
lack of knowledge,
a data problem. It's more of resources. Yeah.
So do you agree, Wanjiku, that perhaps it's just an issue of the fact that we do not have enough resources to cater for every single one of us, you know?
Zainab, I think the budget making process is actually a policy process. And in the policy making process, we generally will start by defining the problem. And I think we've defined the problem wrong. And so everything else has staggered on in the wrong direction. And I'll want to start by saying, you know, we are targeting, we are looking at getting more money. And I think yesterday I was listening to the deputy president saying that they're encouraging the president to go out more. But for me, I would look at him bringing the businesses or the meetings to Kenya more. Because that means that our hotels, our taxi people, our makeup artists, our nightlife in Nairobi and other cities where those meetings could be held would be more active, and that means more taxes.
Right.
Yeah. But the minute he goes out with his entire entourage, then he's not bringing the business home. And so we are left here paying for his flights and the, you know, his entourage's accommodation and all that. But he comes home and expects us to fund that. And yet he's not bringing the business home. So, and over COVID, I mean, we had international meetings. I would expect that this budget would address like robust internet solutions where we could actually have meetings where he doesn't have to go out. He could actually attend meetings from here, and that would be cheaper on the taxpayer. And the money that he spends, which, I mean, has been articulated over various media stations, and by various researchers and think tanks. The money that he spends going out could then feed into other channels of money requirements, you know. I would also wonder, you know, we are talking about housing, for instance, but have we invested in the TVET sector sufficiently to ensure that if we need any equipment, it can actually be manufactured here in Kenya? Why is it that we have to buy equipment from other countries? Yet we have so many young people who would be so happy to become innovators to make the first, for example, excavator made in Africa or made in Kenya, you know. And we could take this opportunity to actually build up equipment that we could sell to our other African countries as a way of generating income. But now we are talking about a housing scheme, and we are talking about investors who we do not know, because I think everyone has focused a lot on the 1.5, but we don't know who are these investors. Are they the same people who do the edible oils imports? Are they, you know, we do not know who are those investors.
So there's so many questions that's around this.
There's so many questions, and so we are left hanging, and that's why I guess there's a lot of lack of trust. As a gender practitioner, I also have to ask the question of how many girls, how many young women will be employed by that sector? Is it a sector that just strictly, you know, focuses on men, young men? And that's not bad, but I mean, if women will be left to become the mama pika of the Mjengo section, then really what are we talking about? Equity, equality, missing, you know? And so we are not working in tangent with our constitution and our policies. Yeah.
And Wanjiku, before we continue, perhaps for someone who's watching and they don't understand why we are speaking about the issue of gender and budget, just give us an idea of what really it means when you're saying we need a gender responsive budget. What does that mean for me, for somebody, you know, someone who's watching it from Nakuru, from Kisumu? Why? What does gender have to do anything with budget? Are we not all Kenyans?
Thank you for that question, because a lot of times it's something that is mystic, you know.
Right.
So gender responsive budgeting really looks at gender, the two genders that we know, and that our constitution, I think right now we are having a lot of debates about what gender is, but it's just basically allocating resources based on the needs that we have. So what are the needs of men? What are the needs of women? And how do we allocate resources towards those needs? Now, the reason why you will find gender practitioners talking about women more often is because a lot of the times the needs of women were never factored in to budgets. And so for us to reach the point of equality, we must start by equity, where we allocate a little more resources for the needs of women, because those were never factored in previously. And so a gender responsive budget, recently you would have seen that we allocate money to build up maternities and those kind of things, because previously, and even now in some parts of our country, women are still being ferried very far to actually have their children. In some parts of our country, women actually have no access to maternity centers. You will find that us as gender practitioners are looking at roads and how do they lead maybe to the market, how do they lead to hospitals, how do they lead to schools, because those are matters that women are probably in charge of in the home, and that were never factored into priorities of spending. And so you will find there's a road to the police station, but there's no road to the hospital, there's no road for the school children, there's no road to the market. There's no lighting, for instance. So we basically look at the needs within a setting, a communal setting, and then allocate resources based on those needs. Yeah.
All right, so that's quite interesting, because I know that there are times that we would be asked, why would you need to include gender in such kind of conversations? So that was good to perhaps just try and explain to us why that is important. Now, Faith Ann, when we're looking at still sticking to the issue of the budget and the deficit that we have, so there have been many perhaps suggestions on how we can be able to plug our deficit. What do you think would work best for us as an economy in this country?
Okay, so yes, we do have high deficits, and they seem to be increasing year on year, but even just within the year. So like, for instance, currently we are working around 718 billion of deficit in terms of the budget that has been proposed. Chances are somewhere down the line within the financial year that might go up. But what are our options when it comes to managing fiscal deficit, and over the long term also just managing accumulation of our debt? I think first of all we would need to of course, pay. That is the first thing. We need to pay what's due or what's falling due, and not necessarily default, because we cannot afford to default. We cannot afford to, again, also restructure. There's a lot of conversation around, let's restructure our debt so that we are able to have some resources we are left with to also just finance the other side of our budget, which is recurrent development expenditure, but also the allocation that goes to counters. Why I'm saying I am saying that we cannot default or we cannot restructure is also because by restructuring, you're essentially saying, okay, listen, I am unable to meet my obligations as we had outlined before. Essentially, you're defaulting in some way. So that is expensive in the long run. So it's not an option that we really have. So in addition to paying, I think for looking forward, one of the things that one of the options the government has is just also to negotiate better terms when it comes to its debt. Make sure that it is not expensive and it is sustainable in the long run, because some of our debt that we currently have, when you look at composition, is really expensive, and you'd expect that this expensive debt is the debt that we get externally. But when you look at the domestic debt, what government is borrowing domestically, it's also really, really quite high.
Which is 50-50
Which
at
is
this point right now.
It is 50-50.
Right.
And even to finance this budget, most of the deficit will be financed from domestic borrowing. This domestic borrowing is relatively expensive. When you look at the repayment numbers for the financial year 2021-2022, which is already finalized, debt repayment towards domestic debt was twice the repayment towards external debt. So 50% more.
So the interest rate is quite high for borrowing domestically.
It is
then
quite high.
Why are we borrowing as a country? What is the rationale as to why then we would borrow at half of our borrowing that would be domestic, knowing that we're going to be paying more? Why not just borrow externally? Perhaps an 80% of our borrowing that we do it, we just do it externally.
So even externally, there are two aspects of external debt. So there is the concessional loans that are relatively cheaper and they are over a longer period of time, but there are also the commercial loans that are also expensive, shorter period of times, less terms and conditions the government has to comply with as compared to the concessional loans. So when you say that government then borrows just externally, so you're saying they have two options. They could go the concessional way or the commercial way, which is again also still expensive. Concessional comes with more terms and conditions. Think of IMF and the likes when it comes to concessional loans. So there are a lot of terms and conditions attached to it. One of the arguments by government for domestic borrowing as opposed to external, and which is what they were using to explain why they are planning to borrow more domestically for the coming financial year, is so then we are able to manage our situation a bit more in terms of the currency that our debt is in. So most of our debt right now is denominated US dollar. As the shilling depreciates against the dollar, so our debt stock goes higher and higher. It becomes a bit more expensive.
So you're saying that focusing more on borrowing externally is quite risky for us in terms of our forex as well. So that okay, so and we'll come back and continue with that conversation in a moment. I know we have to take a break here on AM Live. Talk to us. The hashtag we're using this morning is MLiveNTV, and we will be back in just a short while we continue with this conversation. You can tag us at NTV Kenya. Stay with us.
New Sensodyne Repair and Protect with Deep Repair. It's a huge game changer for me. The science is pretty amazing because it really goes deep inside the tooth and repairs tooth sensitivity. I am a happy patient. I will be able to go back to the things that I enjoy eating the most. The science is there. It's going to improve the quality of my life in a big way. The new Sensodyne Repair and Protect with Deep Repair.
Me, sister! Are you having a blast watching my life get ruined?
Why are you asking me? Did I ruin it? You did all this yourself. And you blame others like always. It was obvious from the start how it was going to end.
Think about your mother. She's having a very hard time because of you. Now you take your bags and go to your room, quietly and quickly.
You think you can order me around now?
2 out of 3 Kenyan parents felt that they don't spend enough quality time with their kids. You can help change this by giving a generous voice to Storytime. Visit our library of homegrown audio stories at cadbury.africa and make Storytime sweeter.
Madani. Mimi siwezi kuacha ujinga. Hebu nimeshutiwa bana. Lazima tuashike tena. Kuna majamaa wametia kufa kwangu na mtoi kwa keja.
Leo ni wewe, kesho ni mimi. Sawa, siwezi kosa kukusaidia.
Blueband peanut butter, made with 100% pure peanuts and a good source of omega-6. Grow healthy and happy kids with Blueband peanut butter. Available in 200 grams, 400 grams, and 800 grams. Buy a pack today.
Step into a world where sustainability meets prosperity at the Wheat Expo. Join us in Eldoret on June 29th to 30th, 2023 at the Central Primary Grounds opposite Zion Mall. Discover sustainable wheat cultivation and indulge in interactive sessions. Our farmers balance innovation and tradition to grow nutritious wheat. To partner with us by way of exhibition and advertising, contact Christopher on 0723 401 003. Let's cultivate a healthier, wealthier nation. Embrace sustainable farming at the Wheat Expo.
My mother told her that. She didn't know what it meant to be a mother. Diego, did you know that your aunt had lost a baby girl?
My aunt had a daughter?
That's what she told her.
First time I've heard of it.
Her mother, Robert De Niro, she's not going to leave Chato. The best thing is to accept the fact there's nothing we can do.
Then why don't you just kidnap her?
Because that would be madness.
He has 3 other women somewhere else, doesn't he?
And how do you know that?
I just guessed it. But that's exactly how he can help us.
Head over heels.
Blueband peanut butter, made with 100% pure peanuts and a good source of omega-6. Grow healthy and happy kids with Blueband peanut butter. Available in 200 grams, 400 grams, and 800 grams. Buy a pack today.
All right, thank you for staying with us. You're watching AM Live on NTV as we take a look at what's going to be happening today afternoon, where the Finance Bill 2023 will be tabled in Parliament once again for a third reading. Will members adopt that particular report? Well, that's what we'll be expecting to see, and we'll be bringing you more details of the same later on in the afternoon when that happens. However, our conversation still is around the issue of the economy, and of course on the back of the budget that was read last week on Thursday by the Cabinet Secretary of Treasury and Planning. And I am in the studio once again with Faith Ann Kenyanjui, who is a public finance practitioner from the International Budget Partnerships Kenya, as well as Wanjiku Kimani, the Executive Committee member from the Kenya Gender Budget Network. And Wanjiku, as we're having conversation during the break, trying to understand really if Kenyans understand how the budget process making really is in Kenya. Sometimes it is a very complicated issue and shun away from it. But these issues are very important on how money is allocated and how, because it is the revenue that we, expend, be able to be used to, appropriated in those different areas in government. So do we really understand how our money as Kenyans, are used by the government?
Zainab, I like the way you put it. Our money.
Yeah.
Do we even understand that it is our money? That every time I buy bread, I pay for fuel, that it is my money that the government is using? Do we understand that? That's a big question. And a lot of the times, I mean, we've now seen even the members of parliament complaining that these documents are huge and they are brought at 10 p.m. and they're expected to debate on them effectively the next day. But that's what the public have been going through. The Public Finance Management Act requires that public participation happens. And the way it happens is that there's a notice in the newspaper, and then some government officials or county officials will show up like at 3, and they will give you these huge documents, 500 pages with a lot of complex language, and then they will ask you if you agree with it or you don't agree. And I think that we have failed our people because we do not break it down, we do not simplify it. In some places where English and Kiswahili are difficult, we do not even give it to them in local versions, in local simplified versions, for them to be able to effectively participate in the budget making processes, whether at national or at county levels. And I think the government needs to do a little bit more. I like that this time, in this particular finance bill, we have had a lot of robust engagement. We have had, I think from the committee's report, I think we had, 169 people, and then there was email submissions.
There are actually more than 1,000 submissions.
Yes.
Right.
So they lumped up the email submissions, and then they had the people who came to the committee. And I think for me, that is an upward trajectory in terms of public participation.
Because many people actually, if you noticed, there were concerns that perhaps this is the first time we actually have a finance bill. Nobody knew that we actually had something called a finance bill that used to be tabled in Parliament.
Yes.
Like, and the questions were, why do we need this year?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And so that for me is a good thing in terms of public engagement, but a lot of work needs to be done for us as Kenyans to be able to engage with it effectively. You know, simplify the terms, the economic terms. You know, we're just laughing with Faith Ann and saying, like, we will hear words like debt to GDP ratios. What does that mean for Wanjiko in Mashinani? You know, and I am Wanjiko. So what does that mean for me back in the village, for my grandma who is also supposed to participate and give her views? Are we able to just make that simplified and local so that we can be able to engage with it effectively? And because Kenya Kwanza is a people's government, as they say, that they listen, could they then allow us to interact with it so that what they're doing is in line with what the people are saying? They have tried to maybe listen to what we've said. I don't think they have effected it, but they have tried. And kudos to them on that.
Right. Yeah. Faith Ann, even as you work with, because I know that you work with communities on the ground to try and make them understand why the budget is the way it is, why it is important, and why their input is important during the public participation process. What is the level of awareness on the ground?
Okay. All right. So it's, of course, I concur with Wanjiru. There's still the notion around budgets are technical documents. This is public finance things. There are technocrats somewhere who have been designated with this work. This is their job. But then when you look at it from the point of view of one, this is the revenue that government budgets for, is revenue they collect from us as citizens. What they use that revenue for is to provide services that we need as citizens. So as to whether they are providing the right kind of service, then is also on us to be able to participate and say, okay, you want to construct a road for us for this financial year, but how about we equip this health center? So it's such things. An interesting thing about our public finance management laws is they extensively allow for, they made provisions for public participation. So before a decision is, a budget decision is, say, formulation is finalized, or before it is approved in Parliament, because there are several stages of the budget, maybe just outline. So we have the formulation, where the executive prepares the budget, then you have approval, then this is where it goes to Parliament or the Assembly, they deliberate, then they approve with or without amendments, as we are currently seeing, with the finance bill and the budget, the committees introduced amendments, and then after the budget has been approved, it goes to implementation. So implementation is saying, this is what we've approved, here is how. It is essentially the how. Then there's the final stage of evaluation to say, did we do what we said we will do in the time that we said we will do it, and with in line with the resources that we put together? So yes, there's still a lot that has to be done in terms of public engagement. Like you're rightly saying, some people may have thought this is the first time we're having a finance bill, but we've had it every financial year. For me, one of the positive things with this finance bill in particular was the process. The process in terms of public participation, and not just participation where people submitted their input, because that is something that people have been doing over time. We have been making submissions, and other practitioners as well. But in terms of feedback that was provided, so when you look at the Finance and National Planning, the committee report, it's very detailed to say, this is the group or the individual, here is what they were proposing or recommending, this is what we took up, and if we do not take up the recommendation, this is why. Oftentimes there is no that feedback. So then you just have this one way where citizens are submitting their input, their recommendations, and that can easily lead to fatigue at some point if I'm not getting a response from of what I am saying. If I'm constantly saying, hey, could you consider this to government, and I'm not sure whether they took it up, whether they did not take it up, and why they didn't do that. So for me, I think one of the most positive things that should be emulated by Parliament, other parliamentary committees going forward, but also other government, even counties, even national government in all their processes, is to, yes, call for public participation, but give us feedback at the end of it all. Let us know.
Do you feel in this particular process that the process of public participation was fully effected? Do you feel that?
I really think we made not even just several strides. Yeah, we made several strides in terms of feedback. That has been a very big challenge in terms of public engagement. Because if it's just to say there's a notice in the paper, send in your submissions. After that, then what? Yeah. All
right. And Wanjiku, when we come back to now the issue of, even you talked about the fact that women, they know how to share resources, and perhaps majority of women in our country are the ones who hold the purse in our households, and the ones who spend money. So perhaps as the Kenya Gender Budget Network, do we speak to the women on the ground to make them understand this particular process?
So our network is a network of 30 people, 30 different, 60 different organizations, and we have other individual members. For instance, I am an individual member, but we have community-based organizations all over the country. We are represented in the 47 constituencies, and actually IBPK is one of our great partners. And so what we do is we consistently have webinars, we have meetings with various people, various community-based leaders who are able to cascade this back down to the ground. And so yes, we speak not only to women, but to men as well. Right. Because gender, we keep talking about women, but gender is actually both. We just speak about women because they are the more disadvantaged, and so they need a lot more uplifting. Yes, so we actually do a lot of webinars to train our members, and we work with them the budget process on a calendar, on a cyclical year. Yeah.
All right. And do you think perhaps counties can do more in terms of disseminating information, or should we just leave this to organizations like yourselves and the national government when they can? Do you think county governments have the responsibility?
I think civic education is actually one of the most underfunded activities of government, yet it's a highly required activity. It is a high requirement within the budget making process, because many of us are not used to interacting with figures in millions, yet our budget is talking about trillions and billions, and so when those zeros start getting too much, I think I've even had a couple of MCAs are like, you guys go do your thing, and they will leave it to the budget committee, and a lot of times, even when we are talking, maybe I would even veer off and go back to why we were asking for degrees for leaders. Because when you're in the House, you're actually expected to debate the finance bill,
right,
whether you're in the Parliament or in the Assembly. And so you need to have a level of understanding to be able to debate effectively on the budget. And a lot of civic education is required, and it should actually be a government-funded activity. But unfortunately, we keep hearing organizations complain that they do not have budget allocations for civic education. And our education system, which is currently moving to CBC, has failed us, because our children are being taught business, but they're not being taught about tax laws. So how are we equipping them?
Yeah.
Do they come out with sufficient knowledge? You know, we are teaching them about how to register their companies, but we fail to tell them what the obligations of those companies will be. They know how to do a P&L, maybe a balance sheet, but do they know how to return their taxes, or do they have to employ somebody? You know, do our children understand our constitution, for example? Do they understand that by the time they are 18, these are what the laws of the land say? Why do we not include it? You know, it should be part of our education system, so that by the time the children are leaving school, then they are equipped citizens, so that when you as government give them that identification card, and you want to tell them that now they are adults, they also know what adulting is all about.
Right.
You know, from a policy space. And they are able to live within the law, as opposed to what it is now, where, you know, we all come out and, you know, you're being told you have penalties by KRA, but you don't even know how you got them. You are told register for a PIN, you didn't know what does that mean, you know. And years down the line, you're trying to get a tax compliance, but you find out, oh, you've been actually accruing debt to the government. And maybe because it's not big enough, the government hasn't come back to you, but then they also tie you from doing business, because then you're not compliant.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And before I get to Faith Ann, maybe one thing that perhaps is happening right now is there's a lot of politics that has surrounded the issue of budget and finance bill. Even today, as we wait for the amendments perhaps to happen, I don't know if there's going to be any amendments to that report. However, that is expected to happen in the third reading. There's a lot of politics on either political divide that has sort of shadowed some of the things within that finance bill. Do you think that the politics is playing to the disadvantage of Kenyans' awareness of some of these things? Of course, we know that there are contentious bills and clauses within that bill that have come out from the opposition, for instance, who say, look, if we don't do this, we're going to go back to mass protests. And that really is quite an emotive statement that, you know, they're making. But do you think it clouds the entire conversation around why this is important, why we need this bill clause amended, why we need this already that is good, that we need it to stay and remain there? Do you think that is affecting how we are viewing as Kenyans the finance bill, the politics surrounding the Kenya Kwanza government? You have members of parliament allied to, you know, KK, and members of parliament allied to Azimio.
Budgets and politics, I think in the African context, are married and joined at the hip, because, you know, budgets are actually an expression of what the government of the day has as its priorities. And so they will fund those things they consider as priorities, and maybe underfund or not fund the things that they consider as not their priorities. And so when they have a manifesto, they will use our money, the one that we give them as taxes, to achieve what they promised us in their manifestos. And so they're joined at the hip. In some circles I've been sitting on, people feel like Baba is already late. We have seen members of parliament voting for, or rather the ayes had it on the day. And
which a lot of politics played a hand at that as well, where you have members of parliament allied to this other divide, saying they were sort of hoodwinked by the Speaker of the National Assembly on whether the vote was going to happen on that day. So you can imagine that has quite of an implication on the outcome of the voting on that report as well.
Yes. And so I think first I'd go back to the basics, because the Constitution, the first sentence is all power belongs to the people of Kenya. If the people of Kenya do not feel that this is the way to go, we have a right to say no. If our representatives go then and say yes, and we are still saying no, then we have an opportunity to still picket, to complain, and to rally against it. Because it kind of feels like we have decided that we are building these houses, whether or not you like it, we are building these houses. Whether or not you can afford it, we are building these houses. The committee revised, for example, the 3% to 1.5, but then they removed the cap of 5,000. So somebody who's earning 100,000 will pay 1.5% of that 100,000, which is way more than the 5,000 shillings that was initially there. And so, yes, they listened, but then they did something that took us back. It wasn't the spirit of what the people were saying, was not what was actually put into the committee report. Because people were saying 3% is punitive. They may not have said the 5,000 cap was high, but then again to go and remove the 5,000 cap is contradictory to the spirit of what the submissions were, you know. And so it may have been that either we do not want the housing levy imposed on us. It may have been that even lower that cap so that it comes down. But the spirit of what they did was contrary to what the submissions were.
Right.
And so that is politics playing out, because then we are being punished for actually submitting our views and saying we don't want this thing at all. We were now punished in a different way, because us who may be in the higher brackets of income earning from our salaries then have to contribute more. And you know, some things are poorly thought out, because, for example, those of us who are married, if my husband is contributing to a housing levy, I'm also contributing to a housing levy, then we are told that we shall have houses. Does it mean I will have my house and my husband will have his house? And you know, how does that work? You know, should it be per household? Should it, you know, they need to really think out. The other thing that I think is gonna be politics is, where are these houses gonna be built? I feel that urban planning in our country has been poorly done. I come from Kiambu, which is a very agriculturally productive area. But the most unfortunate thing that has happened over the years is that we have replaced our very good soils with cement and removed all the soil. So we've sold soil to people who want to make their gardens look very beautiful, and we've put up concrete jungles, and we have very nice houses there. And many people who work in Nairobi live, you know, Red Hill, Tigoni, and all of that. I can tell you for free that no one ever died from sleeping outside, but people died of hunger. So where are these houses going to be built?
So there are many questions that need to be addressed on a number of those issues that have been raised, but you still say there's a lot of politics that also...
And that's politics.
That's politics.
That's politics.
You're saying that it's tied at the hip, that politics and budget is tied at the hip. Indeed it is. And Faith Ann, when you look at that, the issue of politics, one of the biggest concerns, of course, for the opposition is the issue of the 16% VAT on petroleum products. They're saying this is going to push the cost of living to unbearable conditions. It is punitive. Do you find the reason behind that, what economic impact that it would have?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of discussion, especially around the fuel levy, because one, it affects everyone almost across board. But government says that in the long run, keeping at 8% as opposed to 16 is essentially becoming a bit more expensive for government, because then they probably have to meet the gap between the two at some point. So then for them, and I think that's one of the, even looking at the committee report, that's one of the clauses they have put their foot down, and they've said, this one we are not changing. You just have to live with it. And of course, yes, there are politics to it. Like you both say, budgets are political in terms of not just how they are formulated, but also where they are approved. And where they're approved is Parliament, who are in Parliament. It's not some technocrat somewhere who their job is solely to approve budgets. It's the members of Parliament. They have interest. People have interest. They're also part of the committee as well. They're the ones in charge of approving budgets. But then what power, the amount of power that lies in Parliament, especially after devolution and the new public finance management laws, is really significant when it comes to budgeting. So Parliament holds a lot of power, and they probably hold some of the solutions to our problems that we are facing currently in terms of debt. So one of the budget documents or decisions that they make when they approve budgets is they approve the budget policy statement sometime somewhere at the beginning of the year. The budget policy statement sets the deficit for the coming financial year. So when you come to the estimates and the finance bill, and these are being tabled in Parliament, Parliament already had a clue on what the deficit will be. So it's not really practical to say that when the estimates go to Parliament and the finance bill go there, that they had no idea. So one other thing that they approve is the medium-term debt strategy paper. So this outlines their debt strategy for the national government. Herein we have what our debt will compose of, the composition of debt in terms of is it long-term, is it short-term, is it domestic, is it external. They also approved this document. So even right now when you're having conversations around the debt ceiling and moving from the ceiling to the anchor, Parliament has had a hand in one or two of these decisions. So they do have an upper hand. And Article 211 of the Constitution and Section 49 as well of the Public Finance Management Act gives them a bit of power when it comes especially to things that we are seeing around borrowing and some of the problems that you're facing. Because then, to paraphrase what these two laws speak to, is that the Cabinet Secretary cannot necessarily raise a loan if it is not in line with the priorities that have been approved in the budget policy statement, and if it is not in line with the debt management strategy as outlined in the management strategy paper. So maybe some of the solutions that we are looking for far and wide, some of them lie with Parliament. But of course, there are also now the other factors to consider, the politics side of it. Yeah, there's what is in the law and what they have the potential of doing, but then there's also the other side of I mean, of course, they're saying budgets are political, but they have some power. Parliament has, yeah.
All right. But as we wind up, because I see that we're almost out of time, let me begin with you, Wanjiku. You know, when you say Wanjiku and you say we're speaking for Wanjiku, and we literally have Wanjiku over here. When you speak of the other Wanjiku who's watching you right now and looking at the budget that has been put forth by the Cabinet Secretary, you have the finance bill. If there is going to be any amendments, we do not know on that report that was going to be tabled today for a third reading. What do you feel, you know, if you're going to speak to that Mwananchi right now who's watching, what do you feel that they should be able to have a keen listen on as this debate goes on for their own economic, success?
Zainab, one, we should be watching our members of Parliament, us who gave them power to represent us. We should watch whether they are actually representing us. That is without a doubt. There are options for us to change them, but we should actually watch what they are doing. The submissions that have been made by various groups, not only from one sector, from all sectors, we should watch whether those were taken into account, because as Faith Ann and I agree, we've made great strides in terms of public participation and in terms of us feeling like, we were listened to and our submissions were taken into consideration. by the committee, but we should listen in and see how it goes, because even today they still have the opportunity to adopt the finance bill with the amendments as proposed by the committee, or as it was just proposed by the finance minister from the beginning, with no amendments, and send it to president for assent, you know. So they still have an opportunity to robustly debate this, and to actually take into account the feedback that has been coming at them even after the committee tabled the report. Can they do anything better? Can they reconsider some of these things? You know, there are some industries, for example, that turn over a lot of money. For example, M-Pesa shops. A good M-Pesa shop will probably turn over $1 million in a month, you know. But is that their profit? And when you start taxing them or asking them to submit turnover tax, you're actually going to start eating into their capital. Did they listen? I don't know. Okay. So we wait to see how the robust conversations will happen, and we wait to see how our representatives represent us. And then we, the people, get to make a decision as to whether we want them to finish their 5-year term or not. Because, I mean, at some point, the bubble has got to burst. Right. You know, you have to decide who's your boss. And I love and applaud Honorable Wamushomba, because she has stood her ground with her people. And I applaud her for that. I mean, that's an example of a stunning woman.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Faithan, your final remarks as a public finance practitioner, looking at all these things, looking at all the conversation that has surrounded the finance bill, now in its third reading, what just a couple of key things that will stand out for you, will be keen on as we go for the third reading?
So I think the third reading is interesting, because if it sails through the final vote and the bill is approved,
I mean,
this
would be the final vote.
Yeah, that's
it.
It
to ascension.
It goes to ascension. So then what next for us? And I think I agree with Wanjiku. It will be interesting to see whether, in addition to the committee report and some of the amendments they had proposed, whether there are more amendments that are coming into place. It will be good to get a bit more clarity, even especially around the housing levy, in terms of its structure and how that will look like eventually, if it is still there, if it still goes through. So I think for me it will be more of getting clarity on some of these proposals, but even beyond that, if it goes through and it goes to ascension, then for us as Kenyans, what next for us? So what does that mean? So it means that has been approved, that has been passed, but for me, I would just say it's not for us to stop here, especially in terms of public engagement with the finance bill, because like I mentioned earlier, now the budget goes to implementation. Within implementation, there are certain decisions that happen there as well. So supplementary budgets may come into play at some point. What will the supplementary budgets do? Are there opportunities for citizens to engage in those processes as well, so that, like we said at the beginning, there are times where deficit goes up during supplementary budget. So how do we ensure that doesn't happen at that point? And is it for Parliament then to open up that process? Because before, it's been a really closed up process where when government revised their budgets, but recently we saw Parliament call for public participation on supplementary budgets. So it will be good to see how that plays out moving forward, but also how the government intends to implement the budget.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your contribution, Faithan Kinyanjui, public finance practitioner from the International Budget Partnerships Kenya, Wanjiku Kimani as well, executive committee member of the Kenya Gender Budget Network, as we wait to see how that will be happening and how the vote will take place in Parliament today at the National Assembly, as members of Parliament vote on some of the amendments made to that report on the Finance Bill 2023. All right, this is where we wind up on AM Live. Thank you so much for joining us. Your world is coming up shortly with Winnie Lubembe. You want to stay tuned. My name is Zainab Ismail. Have yourself a fantastic day and good morning.